Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine, and today's topic is a really great clickbait title: Why You Fall in Love with the Wrong People. We're all gonna love and date the wrong person. We always do. It's inevitable. It's a consequence of this entire system, the whole system that I'm going to be talking about. It's my system, at least, but I have this system in my head for how romantic relationships tend to auto work out for most folks, right? Just a kind of a general framework, guidelines as to how these things kind of must work from what I've noticed. The most difficult part of this process has been learning how to navigate relationships, most specifically romantic relationships. I was a serial monogamist for a long time, and then I found polyamory and was like, screw that crap, and have never looked back. But basically, I've learned so much about myself through sexuality, and I think that's very common for a lot of homosexual males. That aside, during all of those relationships, no matter what the framework of that relationship looked like, I talked with some wonderful friends and I took fairly careful notes in my journals and things, and I've thought about it over the years, reviewing my journals and talking with friends about my relationships and their relationships and other people's relationships. So in today's podcast, I'm going to describe for you my system of how love and relationship works in a nutshell, kind of just from beginning to end of life-ish. Not a big goal at all, but that's okay. That's what we're going to go for. I'm going to tell you the whole shebang, well, at least the parts that I managed to put in my notes as I was trying to prepare for this, including like where I deviate from the classic, what's now considered classic thought processes on this, basically Freud, right? We're gonna have to talk about that because we're talking about families and mommies and daddies and romantic relationships, and not all of us want to bang our parents, but I think I get where he was going, and we're gonna talk about that just briefly. So come with me. Enjoy the ride. I hope that you find some interesting, useful information in here, that the things that I say make sense. They're all founded in developmental psychology and that sort of thing, and there's some information. I hope I do a good enough job of not building too much on what the book talks about. I have touched on the basics of everything that is foundational, or at least I've tried to. If I miss anything, I apologize. So, here we go. Really, when it comes to relationships, I had to create a system for myself in order to understand what's happening in any given moment. Because as a person who is chronic stress adapted, and that's what we're going to be talking a lot about today, it's all about relationships, but there is I want to talk about the difference in how we have to enter and navigate relationships and how long it takes to get to a healthy relationship for chronic stress adapted people versus non-chronic stress adapted people. Nobody gets out of childhood like with a perfect experience. For those of us with chronic childhood stress, things are different. So the basic blueprint begins like this. You're a baby. A baby is born. And then the baby learns stuff, including what love is. And as that baby grows up, that baby acts out the things that they've learned. The baby reads because they learned to read. The baby does algebra because it's learned math. The baby does relationships and love because it knows what love is now. But what happens if the type of love that a baby learned is off? What if the definition of love that baby internalizes is slightly tainted because there was a lot of stress in their early life? What happens to that baby? That's what we're going to talk about today. How can a baby, now a man, like me, learn to shift his experience and therefore my definition of love to something that is no longer conditional or hurtful. So my own relationships can be fulfilling and rewarding instead of just taxing and exhausting and scary. As adults, we understand mentally that love can be given and received in many, many ways. And as kids, we learn that love is given and received in a certain or specific way. And the way that we learn is whatever way our family gives and receives love, right? And each family is different. But whatever way that your family does experience, express, and receive love is the way that you are going to. And that version of love then is familiar to you. Other expressions of love that aren't familiar don't land, right? They other versions of love that are totally foreign from what our family considered expressions of love don't really hit our hearts, even if they're meant to be a loving expression. I mean, you can think about just sarcastic families versus like well-to-do, very proper families versus a refugee family. Each of these groups of people have a different environment, a different context, and different goals. And because of that, their expression of love is going to be very different. In very sarcastic families, love is always going to be given with a little bit of like chiding and a little bit of like elbow bumping, and so like given with every compliment also comes with a little bit of a sting, right? And that's just the way things are. And that's usually because their environments are pretty harsh. And like the well-to-do proper families have a different harshness in their lives. The harshness in their lives is usually predicated on like optics and keeping up appearances. And so they have a very different expression of love, where if like for their goals, climbing a corporate ladder or the capitalism ladder is important, and so optics are important. So the expression of love is going to be also predicated around maintaining optics, maintaining a certain status in other people's opinions. So that's going to be how love is expressed and experienced in them, versus a refugee family is going to be like, it doesn't matter what's happening around us. If we have each other, that's all that matters. And a child raised in any one of those three environments are going to have dramatically different knowledges and experiences and definitions of what love is, even though mentally they might try to describe very similar things because that's what the cultural description of love is. The type of love that will sink into their heart is going to be unique. As children, it's only our parents' love for us that keeps us alive and keeps us safe. So it's no wonder that when we get older and we become adults, that we're attracted to people who have parts of their personalities that remind us of some of those aspects of our parents, because they will make us feel safe. It's literally that simple. I mean, that's basically a version of Pavlovian conditioning. And this is kind of where like Freud and I agree, right? Is there like there's a weirdness that is overlapped between being attracted to your mom or your dad, and it's not that you're attracted to your actual mom or a dad, or hopefully anyway, but that you are attracted to the echoes of the way that they treated you, because at one point in your life, hopefully, they treated you well and they kept you safe and they made you feel loved and they made you feel appreciated and made you feel welcome. And so for the rest of your life, however they did that, that is going to be the most familiar way to make you feel loved and appreciated. But anyway, from here is where things like bifurcate away from Freud, at least as far as I'm concerned. Because trauma does really weird things to the body and brain, and therefore our lives and relationships. So we're going to talk about what it's like for people with early life trauma and with more early life trauma versus less early life trauma. Like I said, nobody had a perfect childhood. However, without much trauma, you don't really need to do that much work here. You're going to marry the wrong person, like in the same way, but hopefully they won't be as wrong. They're more likely will be less wrong of a person for you. And the reason we all marry the wrong person is about compatibility versus attraction. And we're going to get there in just a second, because we're going to have to define some terms. And that's kind of the blueprint in a nutshell. Is like, you're a baby, you learn stuff, and the stuff that you learn includes love, and the way that you experience love is then mirrored for the rest of your life, because that's what brains do. They take whatever your experience is, and then it creates expectations and habituates. So that's what you get. But the romantic relationships of chronic stress adapted people are predicated on changing the negative outcomes of their relationships of origin. I hope what I mean by that is clear. The romantic relationships of people like me who are chronic stress adapted, people whose early life experiences of love also came part and parcel with early experiences of stress, whether that be abuse or neglect or whatever. There are other dynamics that then got weaved in with our experience of love, because all of those experiences came from one person, the person that we depend on, the person that keeps us safe. And what does a husband or wife do? That's somebody that you depend on, that you're like meant to help keep each other safe. And that's exactly what our parents did for us as children, right? So this is where the weird subconscious like overlap comes in. I just don't think that everybody wants to bang their parents. Also, I don't think that's exactly what Freud meant either, but that seems to be the conversation in the zeitgeist that got pulled out of his stuff. So, for example, here, a chronic stress adapted person, our romantic relationships are predicated on changing the negative outcomes of our relationships of origin. The positive outcomes of our relationship of origin are often just continued relationship. That's a positive outcome. There's safety in that. But say that a daddy loved you, but daddy was also an alcoholic. That means that you're going to be attracted to people with certain similar attributes to dad. You may date alcoholics, or you may not date anybody who drinks at all. But there will be something in the personality of the person that you fall in love with that reminds you of dad. And there will be good things and bad things in that. And at the same time that you feel loved and you feel protected and you feel nurtured by this energy that is similar to that of your dad's or your mom's or whatever, that same energy also brought you fear, terror, and pain. So in the experience of a chronic stress adapted person, your experience of love, I'll say it again, comes part and parcel with fear, terror, and pain. So for you, for me, we have a hard time feeling loved unless there is simultaneously some amount of fear, terror, pain, dissatisfaction, whatever. Dissatisfaction is a big one for me. With a perfectionist, narcissistic father that was nice, but you can do better. It's like no matter what, it's just do better. So there's a dissatisfaction that I expect in love. It's very hard for me to just accept a compliment without getting a simultaneous like jab. I come from one of those sarcastic families, so there you go. I said we're going to have to define some terms here. What we're going to be having to define is we're going to have to define attraction, we're going to have to define love, and we're going to define compatibility. Let's do that really quickly, basically. Attraction is an orientation phenomenon, and you're attracted to things that make you feel good. We go toward things that bring us pleasure, and we avoid things that bring us pain. And things that are familiar, if no other reason, our brain can predict what's going to happen next, and that in itself is a reward. So because something is familiar, it is rewarding on some level. So that means that anyone that you're attracted to will also eventually bring you terror, fear, pain, and indifference, or whatever the other crap that came part and parcel with love for you is. You're going to be attracted to people that feel familiar. And if your definition of love, if your experience of love, your internal biological definition is created by your experience, not your mental definition. Those are two very different things. If your biological definition of love, if your experience of love is one that came part and parcel with these other painful things, every single person that you are attracted to will hurt you in the same way that your parents did. They will hurt you in the same way that your daddy or your auntie or your grandpa or like whatever. They're going to hurt you in the same way because it is attractive, because it's familiar. We need love. We need acceptance. We need to be a part of a community. We need that safety that comes through connection so desperately that we are happy to let abuse fall on our shoulders so long as we don't wind up ostracized. Especially as children, that means that you die. If you're ostracized as a child, like I said, the only reason you're alive is because mommy and daddy love you. They feed you, clothe you, wrap you, all those things when you're a baby. So this is the difference between chronic stress adapted and non-chronic stress adapted people. When it comes to romantic relationships, that is. The chronic stress adapted people have a much higher likelihood of estrangement in their family or estrangement from their family of origin, typically due to things like the chronic stress having a negative effect on one or more of the parties in the relationship. And that's why we can use estrangement as a okay yardstick for understanding how screwed up someone's definition of love is. If you are or have ever been estranged from your family, your biological definition, and I really need to get that through your head, your biological and your cognitive definition of love are two very different things. That biological definition, again, is predicated on your experience of love. So if your experience of love had enough chronic stress that you wound up being estranged from your family, you're going to have a really hard time clawing your way back. So this is where we talk about love, compatibility, and attraction. Attraction draws you towards what you're familiar. We've covered that. The attraction goes, okay, now you're oriented toward this person. And like I said before, romantic relationships for the chronic stress adapted person are always going to have a deep, strong thread of changing the outcomes, the negative outcomes of their family of origins relationship dynamics. So whoever you're attracted to is going to hurt you in the same way that your family did. So for those of us who are chronic stress adapted and have been estranged from our family for any reason, you're going to be attracted to assholes. You're going to be attracted to bitches. You're going to be attracted to psychopaths. You know why? Because you're a little bit of those things. Whether you realize it or not, those things are in you, no matter how hard you fight against them, because everything that you learned through observation for like the first 10 years of your life. So we pick up all of these subconscious lessons that we have no idea we've actually learned, and they are what operate our lives. So the more chronic stress that you experienced in your early life, the more stress is associated with love in your biology. And since we don't want our romantic relationships to stress us out, chronic stress folks we're going to have to work harder. Period. Because unfortunately, love gives no fucks about compatibility. Compatibility gives no shits about love. And attraction couldn't care less about the opinions of either of those other two. So we've got our work for us cut out, because attraction will lead us to people who hurt us. That's why we date the wrong people. That's why we marry the wrong people. That's why you don't have a choice but to date and to marry the wrong people, especially for us chronic stress adapted folks. So like I said, attraction is the orientation phenomenon. Things that we don't understand bother us because they could be a threat or they're unsafe. We want to understand anything that we don't already understand to eliminate any possible threats. But if what we're trying to learn is too foreign or different or weird, we're going to automatically dismiss it. That's a totally natural process, which is another reason that we wind up being attracted to the people who hurt us, because that's more familiar. Even though it's not what we want, it's familiar enough that it comes with its own reward. And that's super messed up, but that's the way that it works. So there it is. If you're attracted to them, that means that there's something in that person that you don't understand or that you want to understand. There's also something in them that is familiar, and that's why you're attracted to them. And I mean, that's why it's the word familiar and family. It has the same root. As adults, we know that love can be expressed in basically an infinite number of ways. Out of all of those ways, there's only a handful that resonate with each of us, like we talked about before. As a child, in our family of origins, we didn't have a choice in our treatment. In order to adapt to any situation, we had to adopt a belief system. And that's one of these principles. In order to adapt, we have to adopt. And what happens is we're adapting to a situation that we really shouldn't be in to begin with. And so we adopt a belief system that we have no business believing at such a young age. And that belief system will help us eliminate the cognitive dissonance created by the love and the pain coming from the same person. That adopted belief will always be something that allows their treatment of us to continue, because being mistreated is way better than being dead. And we do depend on our parents. So in our biological memory, those are our options. It is either die or be mistreated. And that's why we all wind up dating the wrong person. But that's not the end of the story. I promise. That's not the end of the story. It's not all super duper depressing. It really isn't. In my estimation, love is meant to be fuel. Fuel for what, though? Fuel to move us from a place of attraction with a person to a place of compatibility. Now, compatibility is a lofty goal that I don't think ever is like truly reached. Some people are more compatible, some people are less compatible, and some people are so compatible we have diagnoses for them, like codependency. So love is about desire and motivation and getting us to be able to shift things from where we're just attracted to somebody who treats us poorly, who treats us well and also treats us poorly, right? Because there's both, otherwise we wouldn't be in the relationship at all. And now it's time for the chronic stress adapted person to own their shit. Because basically, at the beginning of every relationship, like, my greatest commandment is know thyself. And the reason we must know thyself is because you were raised by people. I was raised by people. And if there's one thing that you and I know about people, is people are screwed up. People are also awesome, but people are screwed up, especially young parents. So that means you're screwed up. We're all a little screwed up, because going back to the example of those three types of families, each one of those families is in a unique environment with a unique set of goals, and their entire value system is predicated on that environment and that set of goals. It's the chronic stress adapted person's job. It's everyone's job, but especially those of us that are traumatized, to know ourselves, because we're all crazy. I don't care if you had a good childhood or a bad childhood, you're crazy. Some of us are more crazy than others, and your job in know thyself is to understand your special blend of crazy It's your job to look inside yourself, to spend some amount of time single, enough to where you get to have some idea of who you are and what you like, the way that you act and the way that you react, and what all the crazy is about you. And you are crazy. Every single one of us are, because we're raised by flawed humans, where humans are inherently flawed. So therefore, any offspring is going to be inherently flawed. And it's up to us to know our flaws. That way, when we meet a person that we are attracted to, we can then go, hey, look, this is my book of crazy, and you have a book of crazy, and we swap books of crazy, and then we look through that book of crazy, and we go, and we check for compatibility. As you look through that person's crazy, and they look through your crazy, and you're checking on compatibility, and you're like, this might work, this might not work, ooh, that's a big red flag, and that's a hell no. But you really like them, and you spend a little more time with them, so you start to love them more, and you're like, okay, fine. And that's where the love kicks in. So now you have the attraction, you have the fact that you're not that compatible, but you're compatible enough to give it a try. And that's really all it is each, like, as adults, there is no right or wrong, right? There is no right person to be with or wrong person to be with. The reason you're going to date and marry the wrong person is because you don't have a choice. All of us have to. There is no right person. You have to create the right person, and you create the right person by choosing and sticking to it. So you're attracted to somebody, you have a book of crazy, they have a book of crazy, you compare crazies, and then you're like, all right, well, let's use this love that we have for each other to act as the fuel to essentially give each other the benefit of the doubt, because you're crazy and I'm crazy, and my crazy is gonna get sparked by your crazy, and we're gonna have issues. And the entire purpose of love, in my estimation, in this system, is to be able to act as the fuel to give the person that you love the benefit of a doubt when they're crazy. It's kind of that simple. The things that we're left with from childhood are really bizarre, especially if you've been raised in like a super religious home, for example. Love is always predicated upon you being wrong. Like a Christian household anyway. Like the whole humility thing in Christianity in my household, at least my father's household growing up, the whole idea was that you're garbage. You are dirt. You're lower than dirt. You're worth nothing. You are sin. You are sin incarnate. And you come into this world born dirty. You come through this veil of incarnation that makes you stained. It literally stains your soul from the moment that you're born. And you have to spend your entire life living perfectly, essentially trying to be the perfect person. And if you do a really, 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 really good job of being the perfect person according to some book of rules, then Sky Daddy will let you into heaven where you won't have to suffer forever. And that's your definition of love, because it's not even like just your parents' love. This is universal love. This is God's love, which means that you can't have a good sense of self, which means you can't say, no, this is too much for me, because you have an automated assumption that you are bad and you are wrong, and that your needs and your desires are bad and wrong. And that permeates into freaking everything. And it's not until we wind up in the 700th relationship argument with someone, or maybe over multiple relationships, that we start to realize where all this crap is coming from. And this is why self-love and love is equally important, because we don't think about them as like being the same, because they are and they're not. The love can be the same, but self-love is way harder than other love, especially for chronic stress adapted people, at least for me. Self-love is way harder. And what makes relationships so hard for traumatized, chronic stress adapted people is that we have no boundaries. We're horrible at boundaries. And there's lots of reasons for that. But essentially, a boundary is supposed to go at the distance where I can love myself and love you at the same time. And in the chronic stress adapted person's life, it's a harsh reality that for some of us, Self-love is not an option. Self-love is self-obsession. It is grandiose. It is selfish. It's vile. To be how could you love yourself if God, who created you, can only love you after you have repented from all the things that you've done, including being born? Like, it's super fucked. So if boundaries are supposed to be at the distance that I can love me and love you at the same time, but I'm unable to love myself, then I'm never going to be able to set up a good boundary, because that place doesn't exist. They're just going to be constantly shifting and constantly moving. Because there is no distance at which I can love myself and you. So there's no point in keeping you separate from me. And that's anxious attachment. That anxious attachment is what leads us down what I've called for years, same dude, different dick. Because the reason that we wind up with the wrong people is because the entire purpose of relationships, like I said, is to change the negative outcomes of the relationships that we had when we were children. So if you wound up estranged, then your first step is to be able to love someone without fear of them leaving, or without you threatening to leave because you know you can survive it. And that might take quite a few iterations. And by iterations, I mean X's. Like, it's all a big long experiment to help us shift our biological definition to match what our cognitive definition is. We know that love is kind and accepting and sweet and generous. We know all of that stuff. Even if you didn't grow up in church and didn't have to memorize 2 Corinthians 13? Question mark? Whatever. We know what love is. We know it's good. And we know it's well and all that kind of stuff mentally. But we can't prove that to our biology. And in relationships, it is the compulsion of our biology that runs things. You know what? Fuck that. No. In our lives, it is the compulsion of our biology that runs things. Every single human makes 30,000 decisions a day. Adult human. On average, that's an estimate of 30,000 decisions a day. Are you aware of 30,000 decisions that you make? I highly doubt it. You're probably aware of like 10 to 30 that you've made in a day. Every single one of those decisions were not made consciously. They were made subconsciously, which means that your biology chose them for you. It takes a long time to switch your biology, but that's what we're trying to do through our relationships, through our series of relationships. Because when you first start dating and you start dating assholes, then you eventually, hopefully, start to work your way out. If while you're dating, you find yourself dating the same dude, different dick, over and over and over again, there's something in there that you haven't learned. There is some reflection of that family of origin that you see in that person, and you haven't been able to create a new ending. And so you ended the relationship to start over again with someone new, hoping to create a different ending. And unfortunately, I think the majority of what happens in those relationships is we're hoping that someone else will change the ending for us, but they won't. Our parents should have changed the ending for us as kids, but they didn't. Which means it's your job. Which means it's my job. So when we go in and we start dating assholes, you should expect an asshole to act like an asshole. You shouldn't expect them to fix your problems for you. It's just inefficient. So that means that you have to set up those boundaries, which means that you have to be capable of self-love. But that's a topic for a whole nother episode, or a series of episodes, or maybe an entire podcast, like a whole other podcast just devoted to how do you foster self-love. It is possible. I've done it I love who I am. It's been shifting. For those of you who have been listening, you've known that it has been shifting. I've loved myself for quite some time, but much of that was predicated on my willingness to change who I am. That was left over as a negative outcome from those family dynamics I had as a child. And I needed to change that outcome. And I have. I am. Now, I love myself for being me. I'm getting better at it anyway. I still have the desire to grow and change. I don't think that will ever go away. I don't think it ever should. It still feels a little bit compulsive, but it's so much better than it used to be. And the way you do that, it comes through things like self-care, but also the reason self-care is like real self-care. I don't mean like going and getting a massage. I mean real self-care. And the reason real self-care is hard is because it looks a lot like self-discipline. So if you want to build self-esteem, the first thing that you have to build is self-discipline. Full stop. From there, you can learn to set boundaries in relationships and say, hey, you know what? You did this. I know that you did this thing and you've done this thing our whole relationship, and I've never really brought it up, but I'm bringing it up now because it bothers me. It's starting to bother me. If I'm honest, it's bothered me for a long time, but it wasn't a big deal. So I just kind of wrote it off and went off with it and was just like, it's fine. Just let it go. But now you bring it up and say, yeah, that actually hurts me. It actually hurts me enough that I spend X amount of time, or whatever your reasoning is, that you don't want it to happen anymore. And then you have to say where that boundary is. You say, I don't want this behavior at all, or I don't like this behavior under these circumstances, or could you please be more aware of if this circumstance is happening, that you don't do these things because it triggers me in a certain way, or it upsets me deeply. But you have to do that. You don't get to just be hurt and then expect someone to stop, because they're also making 30,000 decisions a day and not paying attention to hardly any of them. So they're operating on the same default mode network that you are. They're in their default mode network. And their default mode network is predicated on their family of origin, not yours. So they're just going to be doing their thing the way they always have. And since you were attracted to them, that means that it's going to be just like somebody in your families, your mothers or your fathers or whatever. There's something in there that's going to be just like that. So it's going to be a thing that deeply hurts you and deeply offends you until you finally create that boundary for yourself. And that's why we wind up with the wrong person. That's exactly why we wind up with the wrong person. I don't care who you love. That's one tiny piece of the puzzle. I care about, when it comes to this, I care about who you're attracted to. We should love lots and lots of people. There's lots of ways to love a person. And then there's lots of kinds of love to have for and with a person. And then there's lots of ways to express that love. What's important here in this framework is that the attraction is the orientation phenomenon to get you into situations that mirror the same situations that you had as a child. But then you can put up the boundaries where you need them to create the expectations that love has. The expectations of kindness and care and softness and concern. Also, we shift our definition of love from our biological definition to making our biological definition more look like our cognitive definition. And as we do that over time, we build compatibility. Because they love you, you love them. You're giving each other the benefit of a doubt. And you may ask for some weird thing, but that's what the love is for. The love is there to give you the benefit of a doubt. Yeah, maybe you've been married for 15 years and you've never brought it up a single time, but you fucking need to. Not everything, obviously, but bring stuff up. Be able to set those boundaries and say, this is a hard boundary for me. This is a no. And I really think that's how we all move through relationship. It's as simple as like the patterns get set up in childhood, and then those patterns have a certain outcome. And we start to really see those certain outcomes become more obvious around like 30 or whatever, and then you spend the rest of your life essentially trying to change those outcomes. Because that default mode network that was created by the dynamics in your family isn't always great. If you aren't a chronic stress adapted person, you're still going to have to go through the exact same process, but you'll need less iterations because your definition of love, biologically and cognitively, are more alike than the person who was more traumatized as a child. Their biological definition and experience of love is just so different from what their cognitive definition and experience of love is, that you just need less iterations to be able to kind of close that gap. You might only need a couple. You might only need 1, 2, 3 of them, you know? And that's awesome. That's super duper awesome. But if you're a person who doesn't have a lot of chronic stress and you seem to be attracted to a person that does, one, you might have more chronic stress in your past than you are aware of. But aside from that, just be aware that that is the pain and the confusingness that comes with dating a traumatized person. There's lots of good stuff that comes with it, but this is a lot of the frustration. The frustration is created by the dissonance that's created by the biological and the cognitive definitions of love. And we spend the rest of our lives trying to close that gap. So, this is today's podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover. If not, oh well. I love you guys so much. Thank you for listening. I hope that you got something cool out of this. And if you like today's podcast, consider donating on Patreon. Thank you so much. Thanks for hanging out. And remember, stay blessed and stay uncomfortable. Yeah.